Paris Couture Week, and I have a wonderful Parisian hat. We're going to be talking about the Valentino show, and I have a fabulous panel with me who will introduce themselves.
Hi, I'm Shonagh Marshall, and I'm a curator at Somerset House.
And I'm Stephen Jones. Oh, sorry, you lost your hat. I'm Stephen Jones, and I'm milliner.
I'm Oriole, Cullen, and I'm curator for fashion and textiles at the V&A Museum.
Have you made a hat with an Eiffel Tower before? You have, haven't you?
Yeah, I did a little beret, and there was an Eiffel Tower made out of bugle beads on top of it.
Beautiful. Was that for anyone in particular?
It's my own collection, and funnily enough, it was called Paris.
Oh, that's lovely. So how have you all been enjoying couture so far? Because you've been quite busy, haven't you?
Yeah, well, I was working on the couture. I came back from Paris last night, and I worked on Dior Haute Couture and Juliana Serigenko, and that was yesterday. So, yeah, busy time. Yeah.
What have you enjoyed? Have you been following the shows quite
online, remotely? Yeah. But yeah, it's been really interesting. I think there's been some good shows, some great hats at Armani. So yeah, it's great.
It's a very apt panel that we've got, given that we're going to be talking about Valentino, given the exhibition. You must have talked about this till you're blue in the face, so you're probably quite tired of it. But can you tell us a little bit about what's going on with Somerset House?
We have a major retrospective on Valentino. It's called Valentino, the Master of Couture. So its focus is the over 50-year career of Valentino Garavani, who has now left his seat as head designer for Valentino, the brand. And it has two new designers, which are steaming ahead, creating a new aesthetic using the old, I think it's fair to say, but we'll see it later. But it's been great and hugely popular. 139 pieces of beautiful couture, so it's really something.
It's great that when you said the new designers were there, so Maria Grazia Chiuri and Pier Paolo Piccioli. That's the first challenge of this broadcast. And you said that they're using the old and kind of doing something new, because I'd like to talk a little bit about the codes of Valentino as a house, because we've talked, each broadcast we've done, we've talked about the codes of Dior, the codes of Chanel, and I think it gets into this interesting discussion about the codes of Italian fashion as well, which I know you're keen to talk about. Have you noticed, aside from obviously the red dress, what would you say are the main sort of pillars of what makes Valentino couture?
Well, actually, within the Somerset House exhibition, the curators were very keen not to focus on the red dress. Felt the red dress had been done and had its moment. And so the focus really is the couture techniques, the couture, the hands that make it, the expertise, the process, the fabrics. And in that sense, you really could clearly see these kind of codes, as you said, springing up from 1959 right through to the final collection, Spring/Summer '08. So it really was something that you can see the trends developing. And I think being Italian, we were talking about this a minute ago, but Italian style and Italian couture has a rich history all of its very own, and I think there's codes in that to be discovered too.
Yeah. Because you've got an Italian fashion.
We do, yes. My colleagues on at Stanfield at the moment is just working on a big show for next year on Italian fashion. And sort of looking at the background and evolution of Italian fashion in the post-war period and up to today. And I think that it's a very interesting sort of moment really when Italian fashion comes on the map. It's very much about selling an aristocratic vision initially, and not what we think of today at all. And people like Simonetta, Fabiani, Princess Galitzine, Emilio Pucci, all from aristocratic backgrounds, and it's very much that ideal that really sells Italian fashion initially to the American market. And it's something which Valentino, when he returns from Paris, where he was initially, as he worked with Jean Dessès and Guy Laroche as an assistant, and then returned to Rome to set up in '59, and he really sort of feeds into that aristocratic vision of fashion. And it's something that he manages to capture and continue with, all the while up until his retirement and onwards. So it's interesting to look at that, and he's very much a proponent of that. So.
And I remember, actually, funny enough, the aristocratic thing. I remember talking to Simonetta before she passed away, sadly, at the end of last year, and she said she remembered seeing Valentino at the Sala Bianca in the Palazzo Pitti in, I suppose, the late 50s or very early 60s. And she was amazed that a non-aristocrat would be a fashion designer. To her, it seemed to be a really strange thing to do, because all her friends were aristocrats and were fashion designers. And he was very much sort of representing the new sort of French taste of things. Yeah. And he was really like a bridge between the old-time designers and the world of Ted Lapiduski, La Roche, early 60s, Pepper Robin, all those people.
I think, oh, sorry, no, go ahead.
I'd just say, I think in some ways his career and the way that him and Mr. Gimetti, who is his business partner lifelong, mapped it all out was to follow in the footsteps of Simonetta and that Italian aristocratic kind of, they've almost paved the way for him, because in the end he ended up living like an aristocrat and
completely.
living like his clients. He still does, obviously, same past tense. And as does Mr. Gimetti, you know, collecting art, private jets, yachts, houses all over the world. And I think it was always the way he felt things should be.
And he certainly says in one of the books, you know, as a child he was captivated by that world, and in a sense he actually says that clothes were a means to an end, because he wanted to be part of that world. Of course he does clothes brilliantly, but that I think is a very telling phrase, and I think maybe coming from the outside, in a sense, you have a more analytical approach. You can sort of take everything in and then create it in, you know, a blown-up version, in a sense, and I think that's what he's been so successful in doing.
I want to pick up on some of the names that have been mentioned, because we kind of said this before we went live, which is there is this maybe in popular sort of fashion understanding, this idea that Valentino is one of the kind of the only great Italians in fashion working at the moment. And as you said, there's a wealth of individuals who did kind of bring Italian fashion forward, and I'd like to sort of talk about some of those and which ones who you've been really impressed by, who you think paved the way.
I mean, there's so many of them. I mean, the one who's really important for me is Simonetta, who is an extraordinary designer. Really from the 40s she started, and she had an incredibly successful career, especially in America. She was licensed everywhere. She did huge amounts of Vogue patterns. She had a store in the Rue François Premier in Paris, and I met her. There's an extraordinary photograph of her taken by Norman Parkinson, and I had actually met her son, who was Anna Piaggi's photographer, and I went to her apartment and I just wondered if it was the same person, because I remembered seeing her picture in an old copy of Vogue when I was a student at St. Martin's, and thinking that she had like such a fierce look, because she was only at 25 when this portrait was taken, but she had grey streaks dyed in her hair because she thought it made her look more authoritative. And anyway, I went into her apartment, and this was this giant portrait behind, and she was extraordinary. I mean, I said, you know, what's the most exciting, what do you love in life? And she said, Avventuro e pericolo, adventure and danger. And she'd been a really successful designer, and then she was doing a trunk show, I think at iMagnin in San Francisco in the late 60s, and she met this guru, and basically she gave the whole thing up, and she went to run a leper colony in Rishikesh in India for about 25 years, and then came back about 10 years ago to Paris when she sort of gave all that up. But she was still very much a diva in sort of the grand dame of fashion way. But the other, I mean, her husband was Fabiani, who was a fantastic couturier as well. But like Princess Galitzine, who invented the palazzo pants, because it was her palazzo.
And I think the other interesting thing is, of course, there was this fierce competition when the Italians came on the scene initially, because labour was so much cheaper in Italy. And you know, even Valentino says at the beginning of his career, you know, they could really undercut French prices because there was all these talented workers who would work for half the price. And so when they went to Paris initially, Simonetta and Fabiani and Roberto Capucci in the early 60s, they went to set up in Paris, and they were just blanked. The Parisian, you know, the fashion world wouldn't acknowledge them, and they sort of had to retreat to Rome. And that just shows you how fierce the competition was, because I think Paris very fiercely guarded their position as leaders of fashion.
So what allowed Valentino to be successful then, would you say?
Well, he came slightly later, and I think that he did a brilliant job of building up his business initially with the Americans, and he had a very good clientele, and he was very well recognized. He had the I Magnin Fashion Oscar, which Dior had received, and was it Neiman Marcus, sorry.
Yeah.
Neiman Marcus. So, you know, he had a great sort of clientele in America, and of course then in the mid-60s Jackie Kennedy became a client. So by the time he sort of moved into Paris, they were very much ready for him. And I think his background working in Paris couture for 10 years, I think in a way that stood to him as well, you know, because there was a respect there and there was an acknowledgement that, well, he learned a lot from Paris.
But he was also fiercely loyal to Rome and his Roman past, and I think in that sense that gave him an individuality, and he played upon it. And he always says, Jackie Onassis, or Jackie Kennedy as she was then, she made my career. She was the one that, through recognising me, through her friend Gloria Schiff, you know, through her buying all the Valentino couture, that meant that he had that US market wide open to him. And then, as you said, it was later that he went to Paris. And by that point, couldn't really ignore him, I don't think. He was already super successful. Jackie Kennedy, when she marries Aristotle Onassis, she wears a dress from his 68 white collection. And that was just it, really, I think.
Yeah, that moment, yeah.
I mean, it's just like the Duchess of Cambridge with Sarah Burton, really. I mean, it's sort of history repeating itself. And Jackie Kennedy was such a loyal client as well, and spoke about it.
Yeah. Well, she actually said, you know, quite personally, she was having obviously a terrible time. Her husband had been killed, and she really felt that she only wanted to wear black, and she just wanted to mourn him. And her friend said to her, well, come on, I want to introduce you to this Italian designer. She'd spent many years only being allowed to wear US designs, obviously being the First Lady. So Valentino, you know, packs his trunks, and he of course goes straight to New York, and I think he may have already been there, and he unpacks his couture and presents it to her, and she loves it. So she asks for, she's off to Cambodia, so she's asked for a wardrobe to wear there, and I think it was a couple of scenarios like that that really just, they became lifelong friends. They were really, really best friends, and I think it cheered her up. And his Italian way, I think the elegance, the almost frivolity in it all was light relief and fun and sunny, I think.
Yeah. And I think the grandeur of the clothes that he created and sort of simplicity really matched her aesthetic as well.
100%.
I mean, it was a marriage made in heaven as far as that. And talking about working in France, one of his key fabrics I always think is Gazar. And funnily enough, that's made by a company called Abraham, and there's going to be an exhibition at MoMU, which is the fashion museum in Antwerp, next year about Abraham. And this is this incredibly sort of strong, rich fabric, which is very foamy. Now Balenciaga had used that, and that's actually where he wanted to work when he first started off in Paris. But he took this fabric, Gazar, and made the most incredibly sort of foamy, light evening dresses. And in fact, in the Giambattista Valli show a few days ago, he also used the same fabric. So it's funny how you can sort of trace the route. But what Valentino did was he did the sort of the sculptured frill, which was such an essential part of Jackie's look, actually. It was very tailored, but it still had that femininity in the undulating fabrics or the pleats or toe. But it was very, very controlled at the same time. You know, it's a million miles away from, you know, a lingerie from John Galliano, for example.
And it's the volants. You know, we were saying the codes. Those volants come back time and time again through his career. He had something down and he ran with it, and he always says that, I don't follow trends. And I think for the women he dresses, his couture clients, that's what they want, that's what works. And we spoke yesterday about it when looking at Chanel. It has to be worn by people across the board, and these clients aren't young, 6 foot tall, stick thin girls, you know, they're ladies, and these are the kind of women that are going to be asking for a suit or a dress or an evening gown. Valentino's really known for. And to feel special and elegant, and I think he always achieved that. So
yeah, and I think another, just talking about codes, is that the high neck, the high collar is something that he always does, and that again, talking about women of different ages, is very clever, because of course it draws your attention to the face and away from the body. So again, if you know you don't have the most amazing body, although most couture clients do, you know, it's a very clever and flattering way of designing.
And it means your jewels can fit on the top.
Exactly.
Because it's all about the jewels. The Bulgari.
I want to talk about people seeing some of these items, because we've talked a little bit about the incredible work that goes behind couture, and the show notes for today's show, some of the pieces have been 600 hours to make and 1,500 hours to embroider. I think that was some of the things that were said in the show notes. And I'm really interested because obviously you both have a curating sort of perspective on this, of people creating fashion just to be seen, and there is a thirst, I think, to see clothes at the moment. Have you noticed that, more of a popular desire to get involved in fashion?
I think, you know, it's a very healthy thing at the moment for fashion, in a sense. I think as regards exhibitions and shows, there is a fantastic audience out there. I mean, as Shonagh was saying, you know, Valentino's been so successful, which is fantastic, and I think it's really good that London is such a strong centre. You know, I think Somerset House is doing brilliant shows. You know, we have the Fashion and Textile Museum, the Design Museum is opening their new space soon. So, you know, I think the more variety, the better, and they're just, you know, again, we've had huge numbers to our recent shows. We had sort of 250,000 people to Bulgarian show, which closed last month, and you know, there doesn't seem to be, people don't seem to be tiring of it. And I think really what it comes down to is the ability to see the objects, to see the garments up close.
Especially with something like couture, you know, it's this otherworldly.
Yeah.
How do you go about going through an archive of that size, because you've done an exhibition as well with
Oriole,
together, so it works really nicely. How do you go about, you know, stripping a designer's aesthetic down to key pieces and trying to make that say everything that designer had to say? Because I think with something like with Valentino, you said there are those clear codes and you see the clear sort of repetitions, but something like ball gowns, how do you give a message?
Well, I was just actually sort of thinking back to Valentino about the great teams. I mean, that's another thing, it's sort of people working behind the scenes and on the show, and I think, you know, with Alistair and with Patrick Kinmouth and Antonio, I think that's a really interesting dynamic, because of course Valentino, that show, not this exact show, but the idea of a Valentino show has travelled and it's been completely reimagined for London, and I think that's interesting. Exactly, and I think that there's, you know, it's very interesting that team, there's a consistency with the team, and I think that's fantastic too, because Patrick and Antonio have been very closely sort of associated with that for all the different venues, and it'd be interesting to just sort of hear, I don't know, how they've sort of designed set design.
And I think that's a really interesting point in a general sense, to talk about Italian fashion brands and the family, because when you were working on something such as Valentino, there's just a clear idea that there is this team and they all work with and for and, you know, together for the same aim. And Antonio and Patrick have worked with Mr. Valentino and Mr. Giametti, who, by the way, were really involved in the show at Somerset House, right the way from the beginning to the end, and they loved it, so we were really thrilled with that. But I think that's what you get when you work on such a retrospective where you're looking at whole career. It's great to have people around that really understand their aesthetic, and it made it easy to make a selection from what is a huge archive spanning over 50 years, because they had these kind of codes locked down, you know, they've worked with them for a long time, and in terms of the design aesthetic for the show, there's something very Italian about the whole thing, which you can't quite put your finger on. It's minimal, but in places very lavish. And I think it is that kind of Italian aesthetic, very neutral colours with gold gilding in certain places, but not too much. And yeah, I think it really works when you get the right team for an exhibition, and it's really important, as you must know, and working on one designer's work even more so.
I mean, I would say also as well, you have the great exhibition at Somerset House at the moment, but there's a fantastic online exhibition archive,
Yes.
which is probably the first time that somebody's done such a comprehensive archive, which is the Valentino archive, and it is an amazing experience to go online and see that and see most of those dresses.
Yes.
And there's, with not all of them, but with certain of them, there's interactive experiences, there's all the dating, some of the stories behind them. I mean, it is quite wonderful, because I think we're talking about Valentino, the history of Valentino, but it's very much a current house. You know, it is in the news now, and we're going to see the show.
I want to, just before we see the show, I'll hold off for a second longer, because it's great that you mentioned that archive, because I want to just touch on the new duo that at Valentino, and what it's like going into a house like that with, as you said, such an incredible history, and how you update that as a new person. So do you think the archive is key to that? You know, it is, because they've talked a lot about modernity, but
I mean, it's very difficult. I think it's really, really difficult to do, and you don't always get it right. I mean, there's many designers nowadays going into old houses. I mean, in existing houses. I mean, I work at Dior, and you know, Raf's just there. John was there before. Nicholas was at Balenciaga. You know, there's so many different people at older houses, and there is a reason why those houses can exist. It's because they do have something to contribute. You know, if they weren't relevant anymore, they would sort of finish. In a way, that's why the other houses like Jacques Fat, Jean Dessay, stopped, because you know the sort of their world in a way stopped with them. What the key thing is for designers to do is to, you know, respect the old, but really get on with the new. And getting on with the new is actually slightly more important than respecting the old, to be frank. And it's a very difficult balancing act for a designer, because you do in a way want to respect the house and respect the previous owners, but you know you've got to drag it forward. And you can't alienate the existing customers. You really need to build on that and create something new and newsworthy, but also wearable, which is even more pertinent in the world of haute couture, because it is about making newsworthy. But actually, those clients, like Valentino's clients, like Anne Bass, Mercedes Kellogg, all those ladies, sadly are no longer with us. And the people who are now buying couture don't have lifestyles like that either. So the whole world of who the customer is has really changed. I mean, I was talking to Catherine Riviere, who's directrice of the haute couture, and I said, she's on a sales trip into America, and I said, well, American clients, and she said, well, yes, we have but the new generation of American clients who want a cocktail dress or something, and for example, they're not so interested in the day wear and the tailoring. And it's quite interesting to see that in Raf's show that reflected that. Of course, Dior has always been known for an evening dress, whereas Chanel's always known for day wear. So if you went to ask Amanda Harlock at Chanel, she'd tell you a different story. But you know, clients now are just as likely to come from Russia or China or India or you know, all over the world, and they have very different lifestyles and will be buying clothes for their climate, and that will inform the type of clothes that people are creating. And I think it would be very interesting to see. It's very interesting to see that thing about, you know, the fantasy of fashion and the laboratory of fashion, which haute couture is supposed to represent, versus pret-a-porter, and the client. It was interesting that yesterday when I was working on Juliana's show, well, I'm going to get into trouble here. She showed very extravagant fashion. She's Russian, and she got not particularly good review on style.com. But I have to say, I was there, and all the people in the audience were really dressed up. All those Russian girls, you know, all had full-length sables on and wearing diamonds during the day and big hats, because that's what they wear. And the world of haute couture has always occupied that very, very special place, and very special clientele. Whether it was all the Latin American mining billionairesses in the 1920s and 30s, or the Middle East, people from the Middle East during the 1980s, or the Russians or the Chinese nowadays.
And I think it's interesting looking back, when Valentino started out, the idea for a couture wardrobe for a season, the rough figure would be 40 looks for one woman. Yeah. When you think about that, that's just incredible. And people changed for, 4 times a day. So obviously, the market was completely, it's a different thing now. But it's just really interesting to hear the different...
Yeah, and that level of money as well. You say, I know, for example, a Dior suit from Chanel will probably start at about £30,000, something like that, and an evening dress from about £70,000. Well, it sounds like an awful lot of money, but in comparison to how much fuel your jet burns when it's flying over the Pacific, that's peanuts.
And Valentino's another sphere completely.
Yeah,
it's really expensive.
Yeah.
But I just wanted to go back to the original, because you said something about Sarah Burton and the Queen, and I think there's an interesting point to be made with Maria Grazia Chiuri and Pier Paolo Piccoli, is that they both worked under Valentino. They were accessory designers, excuse me, and I think there's a certain kind of carrying the torch that they've really shaken things up. They both wear full black, kohl eyeliner, Maria Grazia, and I think they're cool dudes, and they've brought couture and Valentino couture into a new world, but always using these kind of couture techniques. There's one that's specific to Valentino called Budolini, and they use it in the most interesting ways. And I'm really in love with what they've done with the house, and I think it's very girly and it's really beautiful, but it's not completely ludicrous. You could wear it, so I think it sits in the middle between a day-wear Chanel suit and a Dior or a Luna, you're saying about this kind of dress that nobody would be really able to wear unless you're wearing diamonds in the day, which, by the way, I think is fabulous, and I think we should knock. I think it's great, and I think that is the other world. It's the way the others live, and the jet. Yeah,
I think they've done a good job. Obviously it was a rocky start, and I think that legacy, Faccinetti, I think that legacy thing, when the designer is still alive and very much feels it's their company, and it is their name. We know with Saint Laurent it was never plain sailing, and initially Alessandro Faccinetti was brought in, and I think it must be very hard to look at one person and think they're the person to take on your name. 2 people is a very different thing, and that's what we were sort of talking about, because in a sense they're a team, and that's quite unusual in fashion, certainly in the sort of legacy situation, to bring in a team to take over. And I think they, of course, as you were saying, they were accessories designers, and they've done, they've worked there since 1999 or something, so they really knew the aesthetic of the house. And
well, I have to say, if you're an accessories designer, not having a personal life, you have to learn to sort of dip and dive and fit in with other people, because you're working with a designer, and so yes, you can have an ego, an idea and an artistic point of view, but it has to be mutable as well. There's no point going in there with lights blazing and saying this is my fantastic idea, because it's really teamwork to achieve that look for that girl. So I think as accessories designers, they can fit in with each other and also the aesthetic of the existing house, which is, I think, the key for their success.
That's a really interesting point, actually. And I think also there was, I don't know if you'd agree, but I think there was something quite quiet about the way in which they sort of were appointed and did their earliest collections. I know it's not fair to compare it to something like Dior, where there's obviously going to be a lot of buzz around the appointment, but there's been something quite very natural about this, even though there was that little bit of personnel shuffling when Valentino retired, and I think that's some of that has contributed to their success.
I think it was all deliberate, and I think it has been a build-up and progression. But actually in terms of success of the brand, you can tell their accessory designs, because the rock stud, need I say any more, that the flat pointy pump with the two straps, I saw it in Topshop yesterday, complete copy. And the bag as well is flying off the shelves, and I think for a couture house that has ready to wear, that's really, really important. Perfume,
it's
the
been a
bags
long
and the
time
shoes.
coming in a way.
A really long
so
time.
it is, it is fantastic that that is sort of making a mark too. It's become their pump in a sense.
Well, it's really cool. It's really covered. Young kids love that shoe.
Yes.
Should we have a look at what they have to offer this season?
Great.
There's always one.
Always one.
Running across the catwalk. Great, they should start with flue as opposed to tailleur.
And I think Valentino really, for me, I think the flue is everything. I think nobody else does it like they do. So.
Wow, beautiful braiding.
And the white always seems to be a feature.
How many pieces from the white collection are in the Somerset House exhibition?
I'm not too sure on the exact amount, but around 6, I would say.
Oh, really? Oh, wow.
We have Jackie O's wedding dress.
Amazing.
That's such a fantastic suit because yes, it's got tailleur, but it's flue as well in the decoration. And it's funny because so few designers do soft tailoring, and Valentino was always somebody who did.
Do you think that's something that a couture client would be? It's very flattering and
Absolutely, because it's normally sort of more easy to wear. And the thing is, often with strict women's tailoring, especially nowadays, if you put that on, it looks as though you work for an airline. But if you've got like soft drapery or embroidery going over the bust, it's love the matching shoes too.
And the pieces, they're built up of separates. But I think, correct me if I'm wrong, but talking about Roman, it's almost something quite Roman architectural about the flue on top of the tailoring. I think it's again working in that background of Rome. And
we've seen that shoulder that we were seeing at Shonagh as well, quite a pronounced.
Strong horizontal lines.
Those shoes are fab, aren't they?
I love all the capes.
Well, Valentino couture shoes are always quite something.
Yeah.
I remember a few years ago, they asked Philip Tracy to make those feathered shoes for them, which were beautiful.
They were lovely, yeah.
And also Philip used to do quite a lot of hats for Valentino. He did a fantastic series of Chinese hats.
Yeah. There's a snake Philip Tracy hat in the exhibition at Somerset House.
I think this is Gazar, this dress. You see the foaminess of how it moves.
Yeah, it's an open weave.
And the bow as decoration.
This is a very classic Valentino shape with that little gathered waist and the long sleeve.
I mean, of course, that dress is shown unlined, but that's the thing about couture as well. Couture, you would never see a couture client wearing exactly this, because they'll always say, well, I'd like to have it full length and in navy blue, or I'd actually like to have this as a skirt, or could I have this in a different fabric? I mean, famously, Mona Bismarck used to have her tennis shorts made by Balenciaga.
But it's so difficult to see the detail and the work from any kind of footage. It's very Valentino, the different layers.
Those light, foamy.
Yeah.
with a little tulle frill coming up on the neckline. So pretty.
And it's a dedication to this elegance of not being too showy and not following trends too strictly. I think that they've really carried on championing.
Well, you know, it gets to a point when they're working within their own aesthetic and fashion comes round to them too. It's always the dichotomy in the sort of puzzle. Should you follow the trend? Should you stick to your own guns? Now this real lightness and delicacy is something that the new duo do incredibly well. And I think that's something which is more them than Valentino really, himself.
But I also think about those shows, Valentino is very famous for the wedding dress, always has been. But I think there's probably around 6 dresses that you could wear for a wedding within their collection. They do a lot of white, so...
So pretty.
I think it's interesting what you say about the delicacy, because it goes back to what you were saying before about how they are. Like, you just look at them; they are so cool, and with they look like, you know, really young, hip designers that you can see sort of running their own young label. But the fact that they can do something that is so mature in a sense, but also so fun and delicate and pretty, I think is the.
And is it lady? You know, or is it young? I mean, the fantastic thing is it sort of hovers between the two.
It's like what you said about the skirt, you know, it's young and it's beautiful because it's unlined. But
So chic, the black outfit there. Very architectural. I think in double face satin.
He uses a lot of charmeuse. Mr. Valentino certainly did. So.
And I like the very simple styling as well.
Yeah.
It's
the hair is
very simple makeup, very clean, really putting the focus on the clothes.
The hair's become a bit of a new trademark, those little plaits for the designers now, and I think they always follow that kind of low slung hair, not too much effort, not too strict.
Valentino's use of lace was always a big thing, wasn't it, Oriole?
Yeah. And so the cotton lace and crochet sort of placements, I think.
And cut lace, which is very Italian, cut and then layered
lace style.
Was it Italian lace as opposed to French lace then? Is that
it was a mixture, so you'd use, you know, chantilly and mix different laces, cut them and then lay them upon tulle.
What do you think his design inspirations were? Who do you think he really looked up to as the great designers? Was it Balenciaga?
He does mention Worth quite a lot. And, you know, I think that we can't ignore sort of his work with Dessay, which I think does feed into certainly the pleats that you
think that was really
kind of think of. Yeah. But, yeah, I think I think he himself feels he developed his own aesthetic. I haven't seen him reference.
Is this the music that we're hearing? Is this the real music in the show?
I think so.
This is the music from the draftsman's contract, I think. Which is, I can't remember what it is now.
O'Donnell colour too, along with this sort of black, white and red. You always think of Valentino, but often this colour comes up quite a lot, certainly in the more recent collections.
Yeah, the light pinks, the light greens, the light blues.
Yeah,
were much later
pastel.
Mr. Valentino, but he did certainly embrace them.
Love this. On that jacket on the left, the embroidery appeared to be underneath the surface of the cloth.
Yeah, that layering technique is interesting too
Yeah.
with Valentino quite a lot. You get lace below or above the black and white.
Wow, amazing fabrics.
Such a simplicity to it as well.
Because the fabrics themselves are so opulent.
Yeah,
But it looks so clean and so
Yeah.
fresh.
Yeah, the
Yeah,
lines
and
are
really
very clean.
sort of almost within that modernistic vibe.
Beautiful. So what are our first reactions? It's always a really cruel question to ask. It's like when you come out of a show and someone sticks it in your face and asks you. But did you like it, Stephen?
Yeah, I think it looked beautiful and delicate, and I love the here's the finale now, and it's almost you see the show better in the finale than you do, because you really see. So
The ordering.
it's not only what you put into a show, it's what you leave out. And you know, most of it is in very, very neutral colours. There's, I think, 2 or 3 red dresses in there, but that's it. So the focus really is on the silhouette and the luxury of the materials and the make. And it's quite a classic aesthetic. It's quite simple, but that's what looks modern. Of course, what looks modern now is different to what looked modern in 1959. There's always a different, you know, what modern do you want to pick? There's 1,000 of them out there. But if you look at that red dress there,
it's very
you know,
clean.
it could be space age.
Yeah.
I think that they are perfectly in tune with the times.
Yeah. But do you think that's because there are those such key sort of signatures and such key codes related to, you know, the fabric and the techniques, as we've already discussed? Do you think that's what allows them to make things that do appear so modern, because they've almost got this wonderful framework to work in, which although it's quite narrow, it's actually more liberating because it does allow them to, you know, play with things like shape and...
I mean, there was an interesting dress there which was black ruffles on tulle, and they brought the ruffles all the way up from the skirt and then into an asymmetric shoulder, which I thought was a clever way of playing with that idea of this sort of ruffled skirt. And
And that last red dress, sorry, I have to interject there, it's just fantastic the way it's got that raised shoulder. And there they
Here
are.
they are.
Always in black. But I think it's interesting the way they decide to show in such a pared down way. Very straightforward, very chic, fireplaces, chandeliers, and you know what you're going to get. And they've never really kind of explored out of that setup. You know, Dior, we saw an enchanted forest of sorts, and then Lagerfeld was almost a snow forest, Shonagh. But this is just really straightforward and simple.
Yeah,
See the clothes.
that's salon aesthetic, I think, that has always been another element of Valentino that they, you know, have stuck to, and they sort of don't use props or set design.
It's not the storytelling vibes you see out of work.
Yeah.
But you've worked, obviously, Stephen, you've worked with a lot of couturiers, but people who do champion that storyteller.
Yeah.
And do you think that we're seeing that in the clothes there? Or
I think, oh, absolutely, they're telling a story. And they're telling a story of unbelievable opulence within a very simplistic setting, in a way. Because there's no hair, there's like minimal hair, there's very minimal accessories, there isn't like a patterned carpet, there's no giant flowers, there's, you know, a few chandeliers, yes, admittedly, but I think, you know, they got the balance just right. You know, within design, there's always a point of focus, and there's a point of an area of simplicity. If you look at one of Nick's photographs, there's a big area of plain with an area of something sort of jazzy going on, and what they've done is they've made that dress, when it goes into a room, to be the focus of that room, because it's got so much going on. Is that my phone going bleep bleep?
Don't worry.
So I think it was within spring summer 2013 where we saw Carl, as you said before, doing an incredible, having an incredible set at the Grand Palais, Raf showing within this sort of garden setting, but also really applying a huge amount of embroidery, but completely in step with the times. And what's the important thing about fashion? It's all in the name. It's about being fashionable, and it's about being now. That's what makes it interesting, that it's for this. It's not about whether it's interesting in 5 years' time or not. It's just about the now. And that's the sort of stupidity and fabulousness of Chapman. No, because they've really got their fashion antennae waving around and feeling the moment and feeling the right thing to do. And the music and the setting is just as important as the bustard. I mean, of course, what we just touched on before was how fashion is having really another life in exhibitions, and especially haute couture fashion has got. I mean, these clothes, of course, are bought and everything, but now, as we speak, I mean, I know that so many of those clothes will actually go and be exhibited for years and years and years to come, because they're extraordinary masterpieces of craft and art, and in a way, in 20 years' time, maybe they won't be able to do things like that because there won't be the skills.
I'm interested you mentioned that, because that leads us to another point, which is about, we've had, understandably, because we're talking about couture, we've had various discussions about the future of couture and what will happen and whether it's still relevant and whether people will keep showing it. And that's a point that has been raised several times, the techniques that would be lost if we weren't having people creating couture anymore. What kind of techniques are they? Because I think for our viewers, some of the things that actually have come from couture, it's a really interesting idea, and how that's filtered down.
Well, I think the flue, to differentiate there's the flue and the tailleur is the soft and the, well, it should be Stephen telling you he works on the soft and the sort of tailored structured things. I mean, Stephen, you want to get your phone.
Sorry, it's really embarrassing.
We're making it popular, it's brilliant. You're like the man in demand.
I'm sure for all the wrong reasons.
But maybe the craft aspect, I think, is very important at the moment, because there's been such resurgence of interest in craft, and I think that's only helped to bolster the cause for haute couture. And I think if you look, at the situation with the Chambre syndicale de haute couture, how the sort of, I think in 2000 there was a very, only about 18 or less designers. It's become a bit stronger in the last few years, and of course we were talking about Margiela earlier on, and lots of people coming into the fray, which makes sense in a modern way. And so I think, and now that there is this sort of interest in craft, that people are not looking at it as, oh, it's irrelevant, it's only for super wealthy women. It's now looking at the techniques and why it's worth preserving that and saving it.
And we've seen those filter down in a sense, and this is interesting given that you've just done the ball gowns exhibition, and see that filter down into ready to wear. You've got your people like Olivier Deskins doing this kind of demi couture, and even houses like Alexander McQueen, where some of the dresses, you could call them couture in a sense. And do you think that's something that we have seen more? Maybe that's why people question couture as relevant, because you are seeing the techniques on the ready-to-wear. I
mean, I think a lot of ready-to-wear designers make, bespoke pieces as well. I think that's an important thing to remember too. So I think there is this crossover, definitely. And I do think at the moment in the air there is an interest in opulence and evening wear and dressing up that's allowed someone like Uliana Serginko to launch this, this very opulent and fabulous collection. So there is an interest there, but I think people are taking it forward in a more relevant way. Some designers, as we were saying, they will do bespoke pieces, but in general, and the pret-a-porter is the way to go.
Tell me what it's like being in Paris, being at a house when they're prepping for their couture.
Terrifying. Still after having done it for so long. How is it prepping for the haute couture? How is it different? I mean, it's always a design. You know, you're creating a design, and I mean, haute couture is really at the sort of the top of the creative tree within the world of fashion. So for me, when I'm coming in, I'm trying to understand an aesthetic from the designer. I mean, it's new because it's all with Raf, and I mean, I'm working mainly with Raf. So I'm trying to understand how to, not hats to go with the collection. I mean, I could just do that, that would be fine. But you're really trying to understand his aesthetic and where his aesthetic is going to go this season, and he might not even know yet. So you're sort of second guessing, and you're trying to be an analyst and trying to sort of help create this magic world. And sometimes people have an idea that designers come into the room and say, yes, everything is pink, or we're going to do long. But actually, designers mostly don't work, I mean, I think apart from Carl, don't work like that. You know, they're taking like little sort of baby steps, because they're sort of creating this whole world of fantasy in their head, which is very, very fragile. So when you're working with them, you have to encourage and sort of assist that aesthetic development, but you somehow have to make the envelope within which they can work. So it's a very, very delicate process, especially within haute couture, because everybody's thinking, well, why are we making these dresses which are costing so much money when there are starving children in the world? You know, and that whole argument. But at the same time, what you're thinking is, I mean, for example, in the Dior haute couture, we did these like, little space-age bonnets with flowers on. Now, I had jasmine made for those little branches of jasmine. I mean, a jasmine flower is like the size of a thumbnail. Now, all those tiny things were made out of cotton, and they were cut out by hand, and they were all go frame, which means iron, so all the shaping of a jasmine bloom was put in. Each little one had a wire put on it, which was then covered with silk thread to make the branch. Each branch took about 2.5 weeks to make, and it was that big. I mean, it's as time-consuming as handmade lace. I mean, it costs a fortune. But how fantastic in this day and age that there's still the technique to do something like that, and still the place to show it and the client to buy it. And that's something about haute couture. And you can repeat that experience with the feather makers, or with Lesage and Oriole, all the amazing embroideries that we worked on. So, I mean, yes, there is an opulence of riches, and then you strip it back, which is why the Valentino show actually I thought was great.
That's really lovely. That's actually a really nice note to wrap things up on. But before we do, so I do want to talk to you both about this, because I know that you know about it. And you mentioned we've had some shifts around and who's got couture status, and I think it'd be really nice to talk about why that's important and what that means to see Alexis Mobile and Margiela included in that, just before we...
Oh, I think if you go back, you know, to the post-war period, it was very much everybody wanted to be, you know, recognised as haute couture designers, and it was sort of, you know, things in place to make sure that, you know, it was exclusive. Now I think there's a much more inclusive approach, and if designers are willing to be part of the sort of haute couture calendar and willing to put in that work and employ these really talented people, then I think there is more of an open arm policy now to people who meet the standard, and which is really good. I think it's sort of flipped around, and it's very interesting to see the designers coming forward who are you know, working in this way, and it's really opened it out quite a lot. You know, designers like Iris van Herpen and you know, Margiela, as we said before, it's a completely new way of looking at the craft of haute couture. So I think that's only a good thing.
And yeah, I mean, I think it's great it's more inclusive. And also those designers have a different aesthetic. you know, sorry to say, but fashion isn't about you being universal. Fashion's about being fabulously exclusive. It's not democratic. It's demanding, it's bitchy, it's all those different things. That's sort of what makes it fabulous too. And, you know, Alexis McVie, when he shows a dress on the catwalk, it's not supposed to be for everybody. It's supposed to be for the chosen few who, luckily enough, have got that sort of money. But for everybody else, it's a great aspirational thing. And that's why it's even better that there's a shoe in Topshop for $4.99 or whatever. Maybe not. $14.99.
Yeah, $14.99.
And it's a club, and you can't just sign up to that. And I think it's about this kind of flexing of muscles. If you have an existing brand, Margiela, then it's really exciting to go and enter a club where you can use these kind of crafts, materials, skill, hours, handmade, all these kind of elements to making an item, instead of it being for the masses in a way, ready to
like
wear.
Jean-Paul Gaultier
to be.
did. I mean, that's why he did that.
Yes.
Exactly, yeah.
And I always find it strange, and always have, McQueen would do these amazing, Alexander Lee McQueen would do these amazing shows where the majority of dresses were never sold. You know, they went straight into the archive, and that's where they've stayed, and then they had the luck of travelling to New York and being exhibited at the Met. And now Sarah Burton, the same. The majority of her collection is made up of these absolute beauties that could belong easily in a couture show, and the hours that go into them, the feathers, the beading, the embroidery. And I think perhaps that will be, if people start to join couture, and that seems to be the way things are going, maybe other designers will also start to show within Couture Week, and it will build this momentum where it is the aspiration to be part of something like that.
And to push the craft, as we all said, as well, which is really exciting.
Yeah.
Should we give the wonderful duo, I'm not going to pronounce their names again, a round of applause for what was a beautiful collection to wrap things up. Thank you.